The last vestiges of evening light clung to Dragonstone's jagged towers, painting the volcanic walls with a grim hue that vacillated between ashen gray and coal-black. The sea churned restlessly around the fortress as if mirroring the mood of its master, a man with iron in his jaw, salt in his veins, and a will that never bent. Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone, rightful king of Westeros, by his own firm reckoning, stood on the parapet that faced the narrow sea. A bleak wind whipped at the corners of his cloak. His jaw was clenched. His pale eyes searched the horizon for an answer only he believed he could wrest from the gods. A short way behind him, Melisandre of Askai watched her king with eyes the color of newly drawn blood. She was silent, but her presence smoldered. Some nights, the Red Priestess would speak prophecies of darkness giving way to light, of a glorious dawn after a terrifying war. On other nights, she uttered dire warnings about the might of shadow and what lurked in the folds between day and night. The fortress, its halls echoing with the secrets of Targaryen rule, loomed around them like a silent testament to how quickly dynasties rise and fall. Davos Seaworth, standing a respectful distance away, tried not to let the gloom infect his conscience. He was the Onion Knight, a smuggler turned knight turned hand to a man determined to stake his rightful claim. He'd seen the darkest corners of men's hearts, but also the sharp clarity of Stannis' unwavering sense of justice. Now, as his king stared over the waves, Davos stepped forward, half hoping to break the tension that had been building all day. "Your Grace," he said, "you have summoned me." Stannis took one breath, slow and measured. "I have decided," the king said, voice carrying in the biting wind, "to strike Tywin Lannister before he can tighten his grip on the throne." He said it calmly, as if discussing the evening meal. Davos felt the corners of his mind reel. Strike Tywin Lannister? The Lion of Casterly Rock was not just the true power behind his grandson Joffrey's reign. He was the Warden of the West, an infamous commander who had rarely tasted defeat. But Davos also understood that Stannis saw no other path forward. With Renly dead, his Rainbow Guard in tatters, their banners scattered to the winds, and Robb Stark locked in a bloody campaign against the Lannisters in the Riverlands, Stannis could feel the tenuousness of his position out on Dragonstone, overshadowed by the might of King's Landing to the west and the vast alliances he had yet to forge. Melisandre's soft voice came. "It is the will of the Lord of Light that you press your advantage," she whispered. "The flames promise victory if you act swiftly." Davos tried to formulate a measured response, something that would honor Stannis' resolution without discarding caution. "Your Grace," he said, clearing his throat, "there will be risks. We have only just weathered the Blackwater. Our ships were decimated by the wildfire, and though we inflicted grave wounds upon the city, the cost to us was high. If Tywin Lannister stands unchallenged in the field." Stannis turned, face stern, eyes shaped by an anger that seemed older than time. "We cannot wait. Tywin grows more powerful by the day. The houses of the West bend the knee to him without question. The Tyrells bolster the Lannisters. If I do not strike now, I may never have another chance." In the dying glow of day, Dragonstone's basalt walls looked like specters, silent watchers to this fateful decision. The wind howled, carrying the screech of distant seabirds. Melisandre's gown, red as fire, clung to her tall frame. Davos noticed the subtle curve of a smile playing at her lips. She had glimpsed some vision in the flames. He wanted to argue for caution, but the weight of Stannis' stare pinned him in place. When Stannis made a decision, it was final, like Valyrian steel being forged in a furnace of unwavering principle. So, that very evening, Stannis convened his war council. The bleak chamber off the great hall of Dragonstone flickered with the glow of torches and a single brazier in the corner that offered scant warmth. Knights and lords loyal to Stannis gathered, though their numbers were fewer than they had once been. A hush fell as the king entered, cloak swirling around his shoulders, followed by Melisandre and Davos at his flanks. Ser Roland Storm, the bastard of Nightsong, stoic as a block of granite, bowed stiffly. Lord Sunglass, pale and trembling, stood near the back, uneasy since the day Stannis had demanded obeisance to the Lord of Light. Others perched on the edges of seats, tension visible in their faces. They understood that Stannis had called them there to reveal his next move. Yet the notion of striking first at Tywin Lannister was a terrifying proposition, made more so by the reality that the Baratheon cause seemed battered and diminished since the catastrophic defeat on the Blackwater. Stannis did not mince words. "Lords, knights," he began, voice echoing off volcanic walls. "We are the rightful claimants to the Iron Throne. My blood is Baratheon and my cause is just. The Lannisters, usurpers that they are, have done great harm to the realm, and Tywin's cunning ensures that every day we wait is a day lost. At sunrise, we prepare for war. Our ships that remain afloat will set sail. Our aim, to cut Tywin off before he consolidates his armies fully." A wave of murmurs passed around the room. Davos glimpsed more than one man's mouth fall open. Concern mingled with the faintest spark of hope. Could they achieve what Renly and Robb Stark had not? Could they land a decisive blow against the Old Lion? Melisandre's eyes glimmered. "In the night's darkest hour, the shadow of the righteous man will carry a blade of light. Follow the path and the dawn shall break for you," she said, an otherworldly resonance to her words. Few in the room understood them, but all felt their weight. Davos closed his eyes briefly, thinking of the horrors he had witnessed at Melisandre's side. If Stannis pinned all his hopes on the Red Woman's prophecies, how many men might be lost to illusions? But for the moment, Davos remained silent. He was the king's hand, and though his duty was to counsel, he also understood the futility of attempting to dissuade Stannis when his mind was set. A rustle of pages drew attention to Maester Pylus, who held a quill as though it were a precarious burden. "Your Grace," the Maester said carefully, "shall we send ravens to potential allies? The lords of the Stormlands may yet be swayed to your cause, and the Vale remains uncertain." The young Maester's voice faltered slightly, mindful of the fear that had gripped many in the Stormlands, a fear born from the stories of black magic swirling around Stannis after Renly's death. Stannis nodded, tight-lipped. "Send the ravens. If they come, good. If not, we do not alter course. Tywin cannot be allowed to slip from our grasp." So began the forging of a plan that, if successful, might rewrite the entire War of the Five Kings. Rather than waiting for the final blow, Stannis would strike first. He would slip across Blackwater Bay with what remained of his fleet and attempt a landing in the Crownlands or even further north near Crack-Claw Point to outmaneuver Tywin. If Tywin was away from King's Landing, perhaps embroiled in Riverland's campaigns or otherwise scattered, Stannis's direct thrust might break his lines and cause the Lannister armies to crumble. Though some lords murmured about the madness of it, a grim determination settled over the chamber. For once, the men saw a glint of the old Navy might in Stannis's plan. The king in the narrow sea, the master of ships who had once been praised for capturing Dragonstone from the Targaryens, might channel that cunning again and teach Tywin a lesson in fear. And if fortune or Lawlor's favor did not desert them, they might win more than just a battle. They might achieve a victory that would rattle the Iron Throne itself. Deep in the night, Davos found Stannis alone in the stone drum, a part of Dragonstone shaped like a massive basalt drum tower. Stannis stood before a flickering brazier, the only light in a drafty corridor. He was in his old, worn surcoat that bore the fiery heart of the Lord of Light superimposed on the stag. The garments seemed to weigh heavily on him, a blending of two identities, the resolute Baratheon and the chosen champion of Lawlor. "Your Grace," Davos began, "you know I would follow you into any battle. I only beg you to remember, if we fail..." Stannis's grim gaze shot to Davos. "We will not fail. I do not doubt your resolve," Davos said quietly. "But the sea can be fickle. Tywin Lannister has cunning and resources that my brother Robert overcame, that many men have overcome. Tywin is but a man, Davos, and he will bleed like any other if we catch him unawares." Davos nodded slowly, ceding the point. Stannis exhaled. For a fleeting instant, the burden of it all flickered across his features. "You are my hand, Davos, and I name you my admiral for this venture. You will help me chart a course across the bay, and from there we will land where Tywin least expects. I want you at my side as ever." Davos bowed, swallowing any lingering doubt. "It will be as you command." Before dawn the next day, the fortress bustled with the controlled chaos of an impending departure. Men readied the galleys and loaded what food stores remained. Weapons were inspected, swords sharpened, arrows fletched, and blacksmiths hammered out fresh points for spears. The surly cry of gulls circled overhead as seamen tested ropes and sails, cursing the day they might once more face wildfire or Lannister crossbow bolts. Davos led a small group along the docks. The sea air tasted of salt and a hint of seaweed decay. Beyond the surf, the warships of Stannis's once proud navy stood anchored, battered by the memory of the Blackwater but still afloat and readied for the next clash. Melisandre's red robes brushed the damp wood as she joined Stannis. The fiery heart on her collar gleamed in the early morning light as if to reflect the promises she whispered of victory. Only half a day later, on a crisp afternoon that saw the clouds parted enough for shafts of sunlight to gild the waves, Stannis' reduced armada set sail. The ships glided out from Dragonstone's shadow. Sails snapped with the momentum of an unbroken will. A hush fell among some of the men, for all knew they were attempting something bold, something that might define the fate of the realm. On the forecastle of the lead ship, Stannis stood braced against the wind, gaze cast forward, where the horizon dipped and rose. Behind him, Davos prayed silently to the seven he once revered, even as he hoped he did not offend the Lord of Light. War tested a man's faith in more than one deity. The crossing toward the Crownlands was tense but uneventful. Here and there, fishermen scuttled away upon sighting the Baratheon sails, presumably to spread rumors of Stannis' approach. Yet Tywin's fleet was not in these waters. The royal fleet was a shadow of itself too, the Blackwater defeat having shaken them to the core. Silence and salt breezes were their companions. At night, Melisandre would stand at the prow, her eyes closed in silent communion with her god. Some men gave her a wide berth, recalling dark rumors of how Lord Renly died. But they all understood that Stannis relied upon her counsel, and that was enough for them to tread carefully. When land came into view, a rocky coastline north of King's Landing, near Crackclaw Point, Stannis gave the order to anchor. Under the cloak of night, a vanguard landed on small skiffs, quietly making beachheads on desolate shores that smelled of brine and rotting seaweed. Scouts vanished into the rolling forests inland, returning with news of minimal presence of Lannister forces. It seemed that Tywin's attention remained stubbornly fixed on the Riverlands and the Tyrell alliance. Messages traveled swiftly to and from the anchor ships, and under Stannis' watchful eye, the main host disembarked. Knights, men-at-arms, and archers, all forging a foothold on the lonely stretch of land. Tents rose like a field of ghostly shapes in the moonlight, horses stamping their hooves in the surf's lullaby. Davos paced among the flickering torchlight, helping to organize supply lines, while Ser Roland Storm barked orders at the men to gather driftwood for defensive fires. Stannis himself scarcely slept, determined to push inland before any news of their landing spread wide. Melisandre's presence was a constant, her face upturned to the sky as if she communed with the stars. And so, with startling speed, Stannis' army began to march. Careful to avoid the main roads, they snaked through lesser-used trails and woodlands. The terrain was rugged but not impassable, and by the time Lannister outriders had any inkling that a force was moving in the Crownlands, it was too late to block them outright. Stannis' plan was to lure Tywin into a choice. Either race south to protect King's Landing or attempt to gather scattered Lannister bannermen to meet Stannis in a field of his choosing. Whichever path Tywin took, Stannis intended to preempt him. In the nights that followed, the red comet that some had seen months before was but a memory. Yet Melisandre spoke of omens in the moon's reflection on a still pond, in the crackle of flames at a campfire. She told of a moment soon to come when shadow and steel would collide, and only one would remain standing. Despite himself, Davos felt a chord of unease. He had served Stannis through thick and thin, and yet something about the Red Woman's vague prophecies always left his mouth dry. Halfway along their advance, as they neared the Rosby lands, outriders reported a Lannister column moving up from the south, likely a force sent from King's Landing to intercept. Panic flickered through the ranks. The war still weighed heavily on them, and many men recalled the horrors of wildfire. But Stannis refused to yield. He ordered the men to form into a battle-ready line, choosing a stretch of open farmland ringed by gentle hills. "Let them come," he said. "We have the advantage of surprise, of choice of ground. Tywin is nowhere near. These are likely his lesser captains. We will break them, and they will serve as an example." That night, fires dotted the farmland like tiny islands of light amid a sea of darkness. Davos helped distribute rations, salted fish, hard bread, dried fruit. Men who had marched all day lowered themselves onto cloaks spread out on the grass, exchanging wary glances and low murmurs. A battle loomed at dawn, one that could set the tone for everything that followed. Meanwhile, Melisandre walked among them in a slow, deliberate manner, offering cryptic blessings in the name of the Lord of Light. Some men accepted her presence with awe, others shrank away in thinly veiled fear. Stannis himself paced the perimeter, checking with the captains, making final adjustments to the lines, though there was only so much that could be done in the night. His expression was carved from stone. Duty and ambition, pride and defiance all warred behind those cold eyes. Davos approached him carefully. "Your Grace, the men are exhausted," he said. "They've marched for days. Is there no merit in delaying if the Lannisters do not arrive by morning?" "No," Stannis said firmly. "We strike at the earliest light, and if the Lannisters come sooner, let them come. We will be ready." When dawn bled into the sky, pale and ghostly, the small Lannister host appeared at the far edge of the farmland, a column of cavalry and foot soldiers with the lion banner fluttering. They were perhaps 1,500 men, less than Stannis had feared, but enough to pose a challenge. Their commander, a stout knight wearing crimson armor, advanced. Stannis gave the order. Horns sounded in the Baratheon lines, and ranks of men-at-arms surged forward. Arrows whistled overhead. The ground shook under the thunder of mounted knights. Davos watched from the right flank, heart-pounding. He was no stranger to battle at sea, but land engagements always set his teeth on edge. Still, as the lines collided, he felt a dark triumph stirring. The Lannister front wavered under the initial assault. Shouts erupted, steel on steel. A swirl of dust clogged the air. Baratheon soldiers took advantage of the momentum, pressing in. The Lannisters found themselves outnumbered and disoriented, and their leader, a knight who tried to rally his cavalry, was cut down by a volley of arrows. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 hours. By midday, the Lannister force had broken. Many fled, some were captured, and a few hundred lay dead or dying on the fields. Stannis's men, though bloodied, stood victorious. When word spread through the ranks that their first skirmish had been a resounding success, confidence soared. The men cheered for Stannis, chanting, "The rightful king." Davos heard it, his own chest lifted by a sense of possibility. Perhaps the intangible shift in morale was worth more than the physical victory itself. That evening, Stannis had the leaders of the defeated column brought before him. A pair of young knights, trembling and bound, were cast down at his feet in the makeshift command tent. They pleaded for mercy, offering the valuables in their saddlebags. Stannis regarded them with a granite gaze. "Swear fealty to me," he said. "Denounce Joffrey as a bastard born of incest, and you may serve in the rightful king's cause. Otherwise..." He needn't finish the sentence. The men babbled their oaths as eagerly as frightened children. Stannis nodded curtly, ordering the prisoners to be taken under guard. "We will test their sincerity in time," he said. "For now, it is enough." Word of the victory spread fast. By the time they resumed their march, small folk along the way cowered in fear or dared to come forward with pleas for protection. Stannis did not pillage or burn as the Lannisters might have, though he had little to spare for the peasants. His discipline, however, was not lost on them. Some whispered that Stannis was hard but just, a quality they had not seen from King Joffrey's men. Soon enough, the eyes and ears of the Crownlands brought news that Tywin Lannister had indeed taken the bulk of his forces west to corner Robb Stark, leaving only a skeleton host near King's Landing under the command of the Kingsguard and the newly arrived Tyrell forces. If Stannis could maneuver quickly, he might force a confrontation with a portion of Tywin's men, or even attempt a bold strike at King's Landing itself. Yet again. But the memory of Blackwater still loomed, wildfire haunting every shadow. Stannis knew he could not simply storm the gates. Another approach was needed, something that would draw Tywin back. In the hush of a late-night war council, Stannis gathered his captains around the crackling glow of torches. The tent canvas flapped in a gentle breeze, carrying with it the smell of sweat and damp earth. Melisandre stood near, silent but watchful, as if every breath Stannis took was part of some cosmic design. "We will not besiege King's Landing blindly," Stannis declared. "The city walls are formidable, and the Tyrells have poured enough grain within those walls to last a year. We must draw Tywin's attention, force him to return from the west. We strike at what he values most, his own seat or his supply lines. I hear from my scouts that a Lannister supply train moves eastward, meant to bolster the capital. We will intercept it, seize or burn it, and thereby starve the city. With luck, Tywin will be forced to ride to relieve it himself." A young knight, with a scar across his cheek, Ser Justin Massey, cleared his throat. "And if he does not come, your grace?" Stannis' eyes flashed. "Then he loses the supplies, weakening his hold on King's Landing. If he comes, we will meet him in open battle. Either way, we apply pressure that cannot be ignored." The plan was set, and over the next 2 weeks, Stannis' forces harassed Lannister and Tyrell convoys, capturing wagons of grain, salted meats, and arms. Skirmishes flared across the crownlands. In each clash, Stannis' men fought with a fervor that surprised both them and their foes. Perhaps it was the promise of redemption after Blackwater, or the presence of the Red Woman whispering that victory was at hand. Whatever the cause, the Lannister lines buckled. Messages arrived in Stannis' camp carried by trembling ravens. Tywin Lannister's main host was sighted marching eastward, furious at the damage inflicted on his supply lines, determined to punish the traitorous brother of the late King Robert. The mere mention of Tywin's name caused a hush. Stannis had won smaller victories so far, but now the real test approached. The entire realm could be upended if Tywin fell in open battle. Lords across Westeros watched with bated breath. In the damp hush of twilight, the Baratheon camp prepared for the storm. Davos oversaw a ring of lookouts posted on the surrounding hills, torches flickering in the breeze. Scouts raced in from afar, breathless with tidings of Tywin's approach. The Old Lion was said to have a great mass of men, though the exact number was uncertain, perhaps 10,000 or more, an army that dwarfed Stannis' meager forces. But morale among the Baratheons was high, and Stannis refused to consider retreat. He demanded an open confrontation, certain that destiny was on his side. That night, Melisandre held a ritual. Flames danced in her brazier, and she spoke to the men of the coming conflict. "Look into the fire," she urged. "Do you see your victory? I see it bright as the sun that will rise tomorrow. The chosen king will triumph, and the false lion will be cast down." Some men shouted in fervent agreement, while others held their tongues. Davos felt a chill run through him. He wanted to believe, but the looming threat of Tywin Lannister's might weighed on his heart. Finally, in the early hours of dawn, scouts reported that Tywin's host was just a day's march away. Stannis wasted no time. He chose a stretch of rolling hills near the Blackwater Rush, not far from where the river meandered south. The terrain would allow him to anchor one flank on the river and possibly outmaneuver Tywin's larger army with cunning deployments. Archers were positioned on the slopes, spearmen in the center, knights and mounted lords on either wing. Stannis himself took position on the right flank where he could command a decisive cavalry charge if the moment arose. Hours passed in tense anticipation. When the Lannister host finally crested the far hills, a low murmur passed through Stannis' lines. The lion banners came into sight, thousands of men forming a scarlet tide across the plain. Tywin Lannister, astride a massive warhorse, gleamed in full plate. Even from a distance, one could sense his imperious aura. Near him flew the golden rose of House Tyrell, indicating that some of their knights had joined him. The sight was intimidating, a stark reminder that Stannis was outnumbered. But retreat was not an option. Tywin's vanguard advanced slowly, testing Stannis' lines. Arrows hissed through the air, the first casualties falling on both sides. Stannis signaled, a shrill trumpet echoing over the plains, and his archers loosed a volley that caught a portion of Tywin's spearmen in disarray. But the real test was yet to come. Tywin's cavalry thundered forward, surging toward the center of Stannis' lines, seeking to break them in a single, overwhelming charge. Trumpets blared again. Baratheon spearmen planted their shields and braced their spears. The clash was thunderous. Horses screamed, men toppled, dust rose in clouds, and for a moment it seemed as though the weight of Tywin's army might crush them. Yet the center held thanks to disciplined ranks and Stannis' meticulous arrangement. The Lannister knights pulled back, regrouping. The day stretched on, a tapestry of violence. The clangor of steel, the roar of war cries, the shrieks of the dying. Stannis, grim and unyielding, led a cavalry charge of his own on the right flank, smashing into a pocket of Lannister bowmen. Ser Roland Storm commanded on the left, fending off Tyrell riders with skillful flanking maneuvers. At times, Tywin's numbers threatened to overwhelm Stannis' lines. But each time the wave crested, the Baratheons bent without breaking, countering with precise stabs of pikes and arrow volleys. Davos found himself in the thick of it, sword in hand, though he was no decorated knight. Still, necessity commanded that he fight. Everywhere he looked, men were locked in a life-and-death struggle. The ground became slick with blood. A swirl of dust stung his eyes, and the cacophony was maddening. Yet through it all, he felt something stirring in the ranks, a raw, desperate courage fueled in part by the unwavering figure of Stannis Baratheon. Then came a critical moment late in the afternoon. Tywin, seeing that Stannis' left flank was seemingly thinned, ordered a massive push there with his best cavalry. At once, the Tyrell heavy horse joined, forming a charging column that aimed to fold Stannis' forces like parchment. Stannis saw the threat and spurred his own horse. Gathering his knights, he galloped across the field to bolster the left flank. A savage melee erupted, dust and screams swallowing the battlefield. It was in this chaos that Davos caught glimpses of Melisandre draped in red robes skirting the edges of the fight. How she walked unafraid in the midst of carnage, Davos couldn't guess. Her lips moved in silent invocation, and in that moment, a gust of wind seemed to sweep across the field, scattering dust in the faces of the Lannister riders. The phenomenon was so sudden that many men believed it magic. Tywin's cavalry charge faltered just enough for Stannis and his knights to crash into their flank. A swirl of steel, a storm of hooves, and the impetus of Tywin's assault was blunted. The battle raged on, seesawing back and forth until, at last, the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the plains in a bloody red glow. Exhaustion weighed on every limb, and the fighting had taken a dreadful toll. But it was the Baratheon banners that still flew defiantly. Tywin found his lines battered, his men disoriented. He ordered a retreat to regroup, outraged that his overwhelming numbers had not broken Stannis in a single day. Stannis, battered and equally tired, called for a halt, allowing the Lannisters to withdraw under cover of twilight. Dawn would bring a second engagement. Soldiers collapsed to the ground, panting, the dead all around them. Davos stood among them, blood running from a shallow slash in his forearm. He watched as Stannis dismounted, breathing heavily, eyes like chips of blue ice. The men saw their king, unbeaten after a day facing Tywin Lannister at near equal measure, and a ragged cheer rose from their throats. That night was a nightmare of moans, of men dying in pools of their own blood, of stench and delirium. Camp followers did what they could to bind wounds, and the flicker of funeral pyres lit the dark. Many who still drew breath feared the next day's dawn would bring more of the same. But amid the despair, hope refused to die. Some insisted they had seen the Red Woman walking unharmed through the thick of the fray. Others swore they had glimpsed shadows moving across the battlefield that could not have been cast by any living warrior. Tales circulated, fueling a kind of superstitious fervor. At the center of it all, Stannis Baratheon remained a monolith. His face bore the lines of exhaustion, but no fear. Davos, stumbling through the carnage, found him alone on a small rise, gazing out where the Lannister torches flickered in the distance. "Your Grace," Davos said, voice tight with fatigue, "we have taken heavy losses. Many knights are wounded, and we have only a fraction of our arrows remaining. Can we stand against Tywin's host in another day of pitched battle?" Stannis turned his head slightly. "We have no choice, Davos." Davos lowered his gaze. "Our men fought bravely, but they are outnumbered and bone-weary. Tywin is a formidable foe." "He is," Stannis agreed. "But pride and anger can blind a man, even Tywin. He expected to sweep us aside. We withstood him. That alone unnerves him." Nearby, Melisandre appeared from the darkness like a spirit, her ruby at the throat pulsing with an inner glow. "The flames showed me a vision," she said, voice quiet yet firm. "A lion roaring, its mane aflame. It howled in agony, and then the stag's shadow fell across it. This is not for nothing, my king. Press on." Stannis' jaw set. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a moment, as if summoning reserves of strength from some hidden well. Then he gestured to the distant Lannister camp. "We attack at first light. Not wait for them to come to us. We will deliver a hammer blow to their flank. If they break, we have our victory. If we break, then we have died fighting for what is rightfully ours." And so the order was passed among the ranks. Groans greeted the news, but none could deny Stannis' unwavering posture. The men prepared for a second day of carnage. Throughout the night, Davos moved among them, trying to keep spirits from sinking into despair. Some men prayed to the Seven, others to the Lord of Light, still others to nameless gods of the forests. Death did not care which gods they chose. It circled overhead like a raven, waiting. When dawn broke, it came with a pale, watery light. Low mist clung to the ground. Baratheon horns sounded, rallying the men into position. Though battered, they formed up in grim determination, mindful of their king's orders. In the Lannister camp, Tywin's soldiers stirred to the same music of war. In the swirling haze, the field took on a dreamlike quality, as though the living had not yet realized they battled in the land of the dead. Stannis began his attack with a hail of arrows and a sudden cavalry thrust aimed at the Lannister left. Tywin, seeing the assault, ordered his own knights to countercharge. The two forces met in a brutal collision, horses screaming, spears splintering. The clamor jolted men awake from the numbness of the previous day's horror. Davos fought near the king's position, doing his best to remain on horseback despite lacking a knight's training. He saw Tywin in the distance, clad in gilded armor, directing the lines with ruthless efficiency. If only they could strike the old lion down, so many conflicts might be ended at once. But Tywin was well guarded, surrounded by loyal knights. Still, as the morning wore on, a pattern emerged. Stannis' men fought with a conviction that far exceeded their numbers. Twice, they repelled Lannister pushes. Twice, Tywin found his lines threatened on the flank. The battlefield was a swirl of dust and blood and shouting. Then came the moment that might have decided everything. Tywin, furious that the Baratheons refused to crumble, personally led a wedge of heavy cavalry at the center of Stannis' line. The wedge punched a hole, threatening to sever communication between Stannis' two flanks. Sensing the danger, Stannis rallied what knights he could spare and led them in a desperate countercharge to seal the breach. Davos, trailing behind, nearly lost his seat as the knights thundered across the churned earth. The two charges slammed together with bone-jarring force. Suddenly, amid the melee, Tywin Lannister was within a sword's breadth of Stannis Baratheon. Swords flashed. The ring of steel on steel thundered in Davos's ears. Men on both sides parted to let the two commanders face each other in a swirl of dust and chaos. Tywin, older but no less imposing for it, glowered behind the slit of his helmet. Stannis' face was carved in fury. Their blades collided, sparks flying in the early morning sun. For a heartbeat, the war on the rest of the field seemed to fade, all eyes drawn to the confrontation. Tywin, more seasoned in personal combat than rumor might suggest, hammered at Stannis' guard with a relentless series of strikes. Stannis, fueled by unyielding determination, parried and riposted, refusing to yield an inch. They circled each other, hoofs pounding the dirt, the clang of metal echoing. Davos, struggling through the press of bodies, saw a flash of red at the edge of his vision, Melisandre, watching, lips moving in a silent plea or incantation. Then, with a sudden twist of his wrist, Tywin managed to jar Stannis' sword arm. The point of Tywin's blade cut through a gap in Stannis' armor, slicing a shallow line across the king's side. Stannis grimaced, but instead of retreating, he pressed forward with grim finality, smashing his hilt against Tywin's pauldron. The older man swayed in the saddle. In that heartbeat, Stannis reversed his grip and thrust, the tip of his sword piercing the gap beneath Tywin's arm. Tywin roared in agony. Blood spattered Stannis' gauntlet. The blow was not an instant kill, but it was grievous enough that Tywin sagged in the saddle, eyes wide. Shouts erupted. Lannister knights rushed forward to save their lord. Stannis' men pushed to finish the job. In the confusion, Tywin was dragged away by his loyal retainers, a trail of blood marking his path. Stannis, breathing heavily, was shielded by his knights as he fought off more Lannister soldiers. The line threatened to descend into chaos, but the sight of Tywin falling grievously wounded rippled through the Lannister ranks. Command began to splinter, some men losing heart without Tywin's iron presence. Sensing the shift, Stannis bellowed, "Press the attack." With a rallying cry, the Baratheons surged forward. Confusion swept the Lannister ranks. Some tried to stand their ground, while others fell back, uncertain who now commanded them. The Tyrell contingent, realizing the precariousness of their situation, began a fighting withdrawal. Soon, the entire left of the Lannister line crumbled, dissolving into chaotic flight or desperate pockets of resistance. It was not an outright slaughter. Stannis' men were too tired to pursue with full vigor, and many Lannisters put up a bitter fight. But as the hours wore on, the banner of the crowned stag advanced across the field. By the time the sun stood high overhead, the Lannister host was in tatters, streaming away to the west, carrying with them their wounded lord who bled profusely and might not survive. Tywin's defeat was total. Stannis had not only outlasted him, he had delivered a near-fatal blow. Word would spread like wildfire across Westeros. Tywin Lannister had been bested in battle, possibly struck down for good. In the aftermath, Stannis' army stood victorious, though the cost was high. Bodies littered the plains, red mud forming around the fallen. Cheers rose again for the king, frenzied and raw. Men clapped each other on the back, disbelief warring with elation. Stannis remained mounted, sword dripping blood. His face was drawn, the wound in his side clearly paining him, but he refused to show weakness. Instead, he raised his blade to the sky. Shouts of victory roared back at him. Davos, reeling, found he had tears in his eyes. The unthinkable had happened. They had beaten Tywin Lannister, the most feared battle commander in the realm. It was a moment that could reshape the War of the Five Kings. Who would stand with the Lannisters now? The very notion of Tywin's army scattering would send tremors through the Crownlands and beyond. Perhaps it would embolden the North. Perhaps it would make the Tyrells reconsider their alliance. Perhaps, just perhaps, it might win Stannis the throne he so desired. Melisandre appeared at Stannis' side, her voice rising above the din. "Behold the power of the Lord's chosen. The usurper lion is struck low." Her words resonated in the hearts of the weary soldiers, many of whom had seen wonders this day they could not easily explain. That evening, in a hastily erected command pavilion on the blood-soaked field, Stannis finally allowed a maester to tend his wound. Davos stood by, exhaustion threatening to collapse him. Melisandre watched calmly, that subtle smile ghosting her lips. The maester grimaced at the cut but pronounced it non-fatal if infection was kept at bay. Stannis looked at Davos. For once, there was a faint glimmer of something akin to satisfaction in the king's eyes. "We have dealt the Lannisters a blow from which they may never recover. Now," he said in a low tone, "we solidify this victory. Send riders to every corner of the realm. Let them know, Tywin Lannister has been broken in the field. We are the rightful victors and we offer pardon to those who bend the knee. If they do not, they shall face the same fate as their lion." Davos bowed, feeling the surge of relief and adrenaline mingle. "It will be done, Your Grace." Melisandre's voice dipped to a hush. "The war is not yet over," she intoned almost reverently. "Shadows still lurk and the Great Other has many servants. But Lawler's champion stands triumphant this day. Rejoice in this victory, but keep watch for the battles yet to come." As night fell, a cold wind swept over the battlefield. Pyres were lit for the dead on both sides, their flames climbing high into the star-speckled sky. Soldiers huddled around campfires, speaking in hushed tones about the shocking turn of events. Some toasted their cups to King Stannis, while others prayed for the souls of their fallen comrades. The reek of death hung thick, a reminder that victory always came at a dreadful price. Yet in that moment of smoke and flame, of dust settling on the freshly turned soil, a new chapter seemed to open in the War of the Five Kings. The unstoppable Tywin Lannister had been halted, perhaps forever. The path to King's Landing and the Iron Throne lay open in a way it never had before, and it was Stannis Baratheon, the unyielding Lord of Dragonstone, who would decide how to tread it. All the realm would now wait to see whether he could transform this triumph into a lasting crown, or whether the tides of war would sweep him away as they had so many before. Smoke mingled with the first pale glimmers of moonlight. The dead lay in uneven rows, some heaped where the tide of battle had crashed most violently. Others, flung wide, had crawled a few final paces before dying in the grass. Overhead, the stars hung like distant torches, bearing silent witness to the day's bloodletting. At the center of the plain, the crowned stag banner drooped in the evening wind, its folds stiff with dried gore. A hush had descended on the victorious camp. War had spoken. And still, it was not finished. Stannis Baratheon, king of Westeros by his own unyielding claim, stood under a hastily erected pavilion of dark canvas, propped on a staff of black oak while a young maester bandaged the cut in his side. The wound was shallow, but he had lost blood. His jaw was clenched, as if by sheer force of will he refused to acknowledge pain. By torchlight, his face seemed chiseled from flint, cold eyes, tight mouth, the hollows of his cheeks accented by exhaustion and the swirl of stubble. Many men might have permitted themselves a moment of triumph after beating Tywin Lannister in not one but two brutal engagements. Not Stannis. Across the pavilion's threshold, Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, his loyal hand waited in subdued silence. Mud and blue. De-streaked Davos's cheeks, and he clutched his sword in a half-numbed hand. He watched the maester's careful motions and noted how Stannis's shoulders quivered with tension. Outside, the night was punctuated by moans of the wounded, the crackle of funeral pyres, and the low rush of conversation from men too astonished to realize that Tywin Lannister, that fearsome old lion, might well die from his injuries. It was a moment that could overturn the balance of power in all the Seven Kingdoms. Melisandre stood behind Davos, a stately silhouette in her scarlet robes, hair like living flame in the torchlight. She gazed at Stannis with what could only be called reverence, the ruby at her throat pulsing gently with each breath she took. Few men in the camp now doubted that she was touched by something uncanny. Only days ago, she had roamed the battlefield without armor and scathed as chaos erupted around her. Even the most hardened knights had begun to whisper of her powers, whether they liked or feared her. When the maester finally tied off the bandage, Stannis growled a curt dismissal. The man bowed and left quickly. Stannis inclined his head ever so slightly to Davos, permitting him to step closer. His voice was sandpaper soft. "Report." Davos drew in a deep breath. "Victory, Your Grace, but a costly one. Our scouts say the Lannister host is scattered. Some fled west, others south, carrying Lord Tywin on a litter. Rumors say he still lives, but he bleeds freely. They lack time in order to mount a proper retreat." Stannis nodded. "Good." His eyes flickered with something that might have been satisfaction or a pale imitation of it. "Have we corralled any notable captives?" "A few lesser Lannister knights, some Tyrell bannermen. No one near Tywin's rank." Davos hesitated, stepping over a muddy patch of ground. "Your Grace, the men have fought 2 days without respite. Our losses are not trifling. We must rest, tend the wounded, and gather supplies." Stannis breathed out. We'll allow a single night's rest, no more. Tomorrow, we move. Tywin's forces may be in disarray, but they will regroup if we grant them too long. I will not forfeit this advantage." The king's eyes slid to Melisandre. Her lips parted in a faint smile. "The flames show a golden keep trembling, a crowned stag at its gates," she murmured. "The dawn that follows will mark a new era, my king." A slight incline of Stannis' head was all the answer he gave. Davos bowed, feeling a surge of something like awe and dread swirling together. Once he might have pleaded caution. But the raw might Stannis had just displayed, defeating Tywin twice, driving him from the field, was too profound to question with timid words. Davos settled for a thoughtful nod and made his exit, off to organize the watch rotations and see that provisions were distributed. Throughout that night, the Baratheon camp flickered with grim energy. Fewer men had appetites. Too many were lost in memory of the day's carnage, or in the pain of wounds both large and small. Near the lines of tents, a group of soldiers dragged the corpses of fallen warhorses onto a pyre, a desperate measure to clear the field before disease could spread. The stench was wretched. A hush clung to those who remained on sentry duty, for the scale of their achievement was only now sinking in. Few had believed that Tywin Lannister, cold, cunning Tywin, could be undone on a battlefield, let alone forced to retreat while gravely wounded. Whispers passed from man to man, the realm would soon be Stannis's, so long as they pressed onward. Before dawn, Stannis had them pack the tents and gather the battered remnants of their siege engines. The king in the narrow sea had become the king in the crownlands, and now he moved with the momentum of a raging storm. As the pale sun climbed into the sky, the crowned stag banners marched westward in pursuit of the scattered Lannister lines. Scouts returned at intervals, breathless, warning that some of Tywin's men had fled all the way toward the Blackwater Rush or the Gold Road, leaving pockets of stragglers behind. The Tyrell lords who had accompanied Tywin were rumored to be withdrawing south, some heading to Highgarden, some looking to defend King's Landing, uncertain who commanded now that Tywin was grievously hurt. Confusion reigned among the Lion's supporters. The next few days were a swirl of forced marches, minor skirmishes, and the grim routine of battlefield scavenging. Whenever the Baratheons encountered a pocket of Lannister knights, they gave battle. Some surrendered upon seeing the crowned stag approach, others fought blindly, perhaps hoping to hold out until reinforcements arrived. None came. Each victory, small or large, only reinforced the aura that Stannis wore like steel plate, unstoppable, unyielding, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. His men began to call him Stannis the Iron King among themselves, though few dared speak the new moniker to his face. Melisandre's presence continued to loom over them all. At dusk, she would lead small gatherings in prayer to Lawler, praising the Lord of Light for granting them triumph and for setting Stannis upon the path. Davos noticed that more men than ever now joined her vigil around the evening fires, listening in silence or with wide, desperate eyes. The memory of Blackwater's wildfire was still fresh, how flames could be used against them. To see a priestess proclaiming a flame god's favor for their side gave men hope in a world of charred illusions. Davos himself kept his distance, preferring to hold to the old faith in the Seven, though in truth, with each passing day, even he grew uncertain. In times as dire as these, it was hard to argue against any glimmer of the divine. They reached a fork in the road near the Rosby lands, not far from the battered track that led south to Duskendale. There, Stannis called a halt, commanding a more thorough scouting expedition. By that point, the tattered rumors swirling through the region pointed in every direction. Some said Tywin was on his deathbed in Harrenhal, others that he had rallied a strong rearguard near the Windwater. Reports abounded of bandits wearing Lannister colors, brigands preying on local villagers. In the face of so much confusion, Stannis reasoned that the best path lay in pressing his advantage toward King's Landing. If he could break the capital's defenders swiftly, the Lannister hold over the Iron Throne would crumble. It was the seat of power that mattered, not chasing scattered remnants across half the continent. So the army veered south, traveling by lesser roads to avoid alerting any watchers in the city. Despite their secrecy, their approach did not go unnoticed for long. Here and there, they found small folk who had heard of Stannis' triumph and dared to ask for his protection. And so, tidings filtered back that King's Landing was in some disarray, the gold cloaks, uncertain and frightened, King Joffrey sequestered in the Red Keep under the watchful eye of Cersei, the Tyrell host partially present, partially recalled to defend Highgarden from rumored Ironborn raids. Above all, men repeated with wide eyes, Tywin is gone, wounded or dead. Now is the time. Stannis seized the moment. He ordered his war council assembled in a clearing overshadowed by twisted trees, just out of earshot of a babbling brook. Present were the knights who had survived the 2 battles, Ser Roland Storm, Ser Justin Massey, Lord Caron's men, a handful of others once sworn to Renly. Melisandre lingered on the edge, listening with that enigmatic half-smile. Standing before them, the rightful Baratheon king pressed a hand to the bandaged area below his ribs. The pain did not show on his face. King's Landing is poorly defended, he said, voice resonating with quiet authority. The Lannisters are leaderless. The Tyrells in disunity. If we strike soon, we can force the city to yield before they gather their wits. One of the older knights, Ser Hubard Fell, shifted uncomfortably. Your Grace, have we the numbers to lay a proper siege? Word is that Mace Tyrell left some portion of his forces behind the city walls. Stannis regarded the knight with ice in his eyes. We have enough. A siege does not require we match their garrison man for man, only that we choke their supplies and block their gates. King's Landing has grown reliant on overland supply, especially after Blackwater Harbor was choked with wildfire. Our battered fleet cannot effect a naval blockade as well as I'd like, but we can control many roads. The city will soon starve or open its gates to parley. Davos, thoughtful as ever, spoke gently. Your Grace, the last time we attacked King's Landing, we faced wildfire on the Blackwater. This time, we are on land. But the city's defenders might attempt other desperate measures. We should prepare for the worst. Stannis nodded. We shall. Yet the worst is precisely what they have already seen. Tywin was their hammer. I have shattered that hammer. Their spirit is broken. They fear me now. And fear can be turned to advantage. Melisandre's calm voice slipped into the conversation. The Lord of Light's flames show me the city as it trembles. The Red Keep stands high, but shadows coil around it. You must be bold. Drive the shadow out. No one dared question her words or the cause of Stannis' resolve. The plan was laid. The army would converge upon King's Landing from the north and east, controlling the roads from Rosby and Duskendale. A small contingent would feign a push across the Blackwater by boat to keep the defenders uncertain. Then they would await a chance to break through one of the lesser gates, perhaps the King's Gate or the Mud Gate, should chaos and surrender commence within the city. That same afternoon, they marched onward, forging through farmland and wooded copses, letting the battered roads guide them. The storms that had threatened earlier in the week finally broke, dousing them in cold, miserable rain that turned the tracks to sticky mud. Soldiers cursed as wagons bogged down, but Stannis refused to slow, pressing them forward even through sheets of downpour. Davos oversaw efforts to keep the baggage train moving, drenched to the bone, giving half-hearted thanks that at least the mud might mask their approach from the city's watchers. 3 days later, the rain slackened to a drizzle and the spires and walls of King's Landing rose in the distance. It was a sight that made the hearts of even the most stalwart men beat faster. The walls were high and thick, the towers well manned. Past them, the squat silhouette of the Red Keep crowned the cliffs above the Blackwater rush. Yet despite the city's imposing presence, the men felt an undercurrent of triumph. They had beaten Tywin Lannister in open war. What was a city of frightened goldcloaks and a half-committed Tyrell garrison compared to that? Stannis led them to an elevated stretch of land near the Rosby Road, where they formed an encampment well within sight of the city's main northern gate. From there, outriders galloped to secure side roads. Archers unstrung their bows to keep them dry in case of further rain. Pikes were stacked in neat lines and watchfires prepared. Stannis himself surveyed the walls through a battered Myrish lens. Now and again he would pass the lens to Davos and ask for his counsel. The walls, though wet, showed no special sign of readiness. The gate was closed, of course, but how vigorously would the defenders fight? Within hours of their arrival, small folk from nearby villages came stumbling up the road, wide-eyed and hoping for mercy. Some among them claimed they had fled the city because no bread could be found, or because fear of Stannis Baratheon had caused prices to skyrocket. Others, simpler folk, begged for protection from looters. Stannis gave them little more than curt instructions to clear out of his war camp, but he did not hinder them from passing on. Let them spread the rumor that the true king had arrived, that a final reckoning was coming. On the second day of the standoff, the city's defenders made a gesture. A rider under a flag of truce emerged from the gate. He was a minor court official, face pale as milk, who requested parley in the name of King Joffrey Baratheon. By the time he stood before Stannis' pavilion, he trembled like a leaf. Stannis regarded him with an expression carved from stone. The official bowed so low his nose nearly touched the mud. "Why, your grace," he said, stumbling over the words. "King Joffrey requests that you withdraw your forces. He is prepared to negotiate terms of peace." The man's voice wavered, for the notion of a Lannister-bolstered Joffrey seeking peace was absurd only weeks earlier, yet now desperation seemed to reign. Stannis' gaze skewered the man. "Joffrey is no king," he said coldly. "He is a bastard born of incest, and the realm knows it. His so-called seat on the Iron Throne is a lie. I have no terms for him beyond unconditional surrender." The official tremored. "My lord, if you would only consider—" "Be silent," Stannis snapped. "If you return to the Red Keep, tell them this: open the gates, declare me the rightful king, and deliver the false boy and his mother to justice. If they comply, I will spare the city from ruin. If they resist, their blood will soak these streets until the crows cannot find more flesh to peck." The man's eyes rolled with terror. Davos felt a pang of pity. This was a messenger, no warrior. Yet pity and war rarely walked in step. The official bowed himself out, stammering thanks that he was permitted to leave alive. After he was gone, Davos ventured a hushed remark. "They must be terrified. Otherwise, they would never propose terms." Stannis' lip curled in scorn. "I do not trust anything that slithers from Cersei's nest." Then he cast his gaze toward Melisandre. She nodded as if in response to an unspoken question. Stannis' voice dropped lower. "We prepare for a siege, but remain vigilant. Cersei may attempt a trick or hope the Tyrells send for reinforcements from Highgarden." The next morning, horns blared from the city walls. The defenders had marched out a token force, a thin line of gold cloaks, some Tyrell guards in resplendent armor, a sprinkling of knights bearing the royal Lion's stag banner. They drew up in formation near the gate as though daring Stannis to strike. But they were outnumbered, and it seemed more a display than a serious challenge. When Stannis ordered his men forward, the city host promptly retreated behind the gate and slammed it shut. A murmur of dark laughter rippled through the Baratheon camp, for it was clear the defenders' hearts were not in open battle. That same day, outriders reported that the Rosby Road and King's Road leading north were fully under Baratheon control. To the south, scattered Tyrell knights patrolled, uncertain whether to remain loyal to Joffrey or recall themselves to defend the Reach. The entire region around King's Landing quaked under the weight of Stannis' presence. Now, as the lines of supply tightened, the city's markets would begin to starve. It might not take long. Still, war seldom yields so easily. Word reached Stannis that Cersei had appealed to Pax de Redwyne, whose fleet patrolled the seas around the Reach. A rumor circulated that the Redwynes might attempt to break any seaborne blockade or slip in supplies. But Stannis' own navy, though battered by the wildfire of Blackwater Bay, still possessed cunning captains who could harass shipping lanes. It was a dangerous contest, akin to a game of cat and mouse. For every barrel of grain smuggled into King's Landing, 2 more might be intercepted by Baratheon patrols. Over days, the city's panic would grow. Within a fortnight, the siege took shape. From scattered vantage points, Stannis' archers would fire warning shots at any who ventured too close to the outer walls. The gate towers bristled with crossbowmen, but rarely did either side engage in more than sporadic skirmishing. The standoff stretched morning to evening. By day, the city glowered behind stone ramparts. By night, watchfires dotted the fields around the gates. Men paced in the glow of torches, aware that the memory of wildfire haunted them all. In the Baratheon command pavilion, Melisandre held quiet gatherings to burn small effigies. Some men claimed these effigies represented Cersei, Joffrey, or the entire House Lannister. Others, more frightened, said the shapes resembled something older, a shadow in the shape of a crown. Whatever her true purpose, the Red Woman's nightly rituals stoked an atmosphere of foreboding as the siege ground on. Davos watched it all warily, uneasy with each flicker of her rubied collar. Meanwhile, ravens flitted in from across the realm, bringing news of Tywin's retreat. Some said he yet lived, moaning in fever at Harrenhal. Others insisted that Kevan Lannister had taken command of the West to preserve Lannister lands from encroachment by the victorious king in the north, Robb Stark. The Riverlands were in chaos, rife with bloodshed between northern forces, the Freys, and scattered Lannister garrisons. Dorne remained silent, its lords watchful. The Iron Islands pillaged the Reach's coastline. Everywhere, the grip of House Lannister was loosening, undone by their lord's downfall. Davos sometimes reported these tidings to Stannis in the quiet of early morning when the king emerged from a fitful sleep to plan the day's strategy. Each time, Stannis' response was the same: "Good. Let them tear each other apart if they will. My purpose is here." And so King's Landing sat under siege, with supplies dwindling behind its walls. Refugees trickled out, pinched-faced and hollow-eyed, but the gates swiftly closed behind them. The Tyrell foot soldiers manning the inner curtain grew restive. Margaery Tyrell, newly betrothed to King Joffrey, was rumored to be inside the Red Keep, guarded fiercely by Loras Tyrell and the King's Guard. But none had glimpsed her in public. Joffrey himself had not appeared on the walls, though the occasional sound of a horn or random volley of arrows hinted at his presence. Cersei, as always, was said to lurk in the castle, weaving intrigues no one could fully unearth. Then, on a sun-bleached afternoon when the wind off the Blackwater carried the stench of rotting fish, the city's watchers spied motion in the north. A great swirl of dust. An army approached. Trumpets sounded from the walls and the Goldcloaks rushed to vantage points, uncertain if it was friend or foe. Stannis' outriders soon provided the answer, a Tyrell host of modest size, perhaps 5,000 strong, led by Ser Garland Tyrell, second son of Mace Tyrell, accompanied by some lesser lords from the Reach. In normal times, that number might not have frightened Stannis. But with his own men stretched around the city in siege lines, he faced the risk of being pincered, the Tyrell force on one side, the city garrison on the other. Davos stood on a small rise with Stannis, looking out at the horizon. The crowned stag banners fluttered in the humid breeze. Soldiers readied themselves for a pitched battle that might erupt at any moment. Stannis' face could have been carved from basalt. "They think to break the siege from without," he said quietly. "They are wrong." Yet the Tyrell approach did shift the calculus. Ser Garland Tyrell was said to be a capable commander, more even-tempered than his brash younger brother Loras. If he chose to strike decisively, the Baratheon lines might be forced to pull away from the gates, giving King's Landing a chance to breathe. The siege could unravel, or at least lose its stranglehold. That evening, the Tyrell force made camp on a ridge some miles from the city, W.L. beyond arrow range. If they had come to parley, they did not say so. Tension ran through both armies like a wire pulled tight. On the second morning of the Tyrell's arrival, a rider bearing the Golden Rose banner approached Stannis' lines under truce. Davos and a handful of others escorted the man to Stannis. He introduced himself as Ser Garmin Fossaway, a sworn sword to House Tyrell, with a letter from Ser Garland. The gist was simple: if Stannis agreed to negotiate a settlement, perhaps the Tyrell forces would not engage, but if he refused, Ser Garland would attempt to lift the siege. The letter was courteous in tone, but brooked no illusions about the risk of open battle. Stannis read it, handed it to Davos, and said only, "Take this man to my pavilion. I will hear no talk of forbearance until I see what good it might bring." Then, without a backward glance, he strode off, cloak snapping at his heels. That evening, Garmin Fossaway was admitted to the command pavilion. Torchlight played across the faces of Stannis' knights. Melisandre stood at Stannis' left, her presence heavy in the hush. Davos stood to the right, arms folded, as the Tyrell envoy presented his master's words verbally, polite and strained. "Ser Garland Tyrell wishes to avoid further bloodshed," Garmin concluded. "He proposes that you accept Margaery's queenship, that she is Joffrey's rightful bride, and in return, the Tyrells will press King Joffrey to name you hand of the king and protector of the realm, as you are the late King Robert's true brother." A quiet settled. Stannis' mouth thinned. "He would have me serve as hand to a bastard?" The words came out razor-sharp. The envoy gulped. "My lord, if I may, we who serve the Reach desire the stability of the realm. With Lord Tywin absent, Queen Cersei's power, well, it is less certain. Surely, if your grace would consider a compromise." "Compromise?" Stannis' voice did not rise, but the cold fury in it was plain. "I am the rightful heir to Robert Baratheon. It was I who held Storm's End in the rebellion, who fought for the realm's safety. I do not compromise with those who crown a bastard and push me from what is mine. Do you think my cause is so feeble that I would kneel to a boy born of incest?" Garmin paled further, fumbling for words. "Ser Garland feared this might be your grace's response, but he urged me to present the offer. If you refuse, then he must do his duty by Lady Margaery's betrothal. He intends to fight." Stannis' knuckles tightened on the arm of his chair. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of torchlight and the faint rustle of Melisandre's red silks. The king's next words fell like iron on an anvil. "Tell Garland Tyrell that if he stands between me and my throne, he will face the same fate that befell Tywin Lannister. Now go." Garmin Fossaway bowed in a trembling posture and fled the tent as soon as Stannis' knights let him pass. Silence lingered in his wake until at last Stannis rose to his feet, ignoring the ache in his side. "They will come at us soon," he said quietly. "Ser Garland is no fool. He'll want to choose the timing and place of battle. We'll not wait for him to tear holes in our siege lines. At first light, we strike his host on that ridge. Drive them back, keep them from linking with the city." He turned a piercing gaze on Davos. "You'll command the center with me. Ser Roland Storm will lead the right. Ser Justin Massey, the left. I want the watchers on the walls at all times in case Joffrey attempts a sally while we're engaged. Warn the men, tomorrow we face the might of the Reach. The day after, if the gods favor us, we take King's Landing. Davos exhaled. He could sense the men's weariness. They had waged war for what felt like an eternity, from the Blackwater to the battles against Tywin to this final confrontation. But the end might be near. As you command, your grace, he said, bowing his head. Melisandre's voice slid through the hush. I will pray for the victory of the righteous. Remember, the night is dark and full of terrors, but the flames are bright if one only dares to look. True to his word, Stannis roused the camp before dawn. Though bone-weary from the prolonged siege, the Baratheon soldiers formed ranks with grim efficiency. They marched north, away from the city walls, toward the ridge where the Tyrell forces lay. Dawn painted the eastern sky with pale stripes of pink, the last stars winking out overhead. Foot soldiers marched with spears clutched tight, archers with quivers half full. Supply lines had grown thin, but determination burned in these men. They had marched with Stannis from Dragonstone to the Blackwater. They had seen Tywin Lannister broken. For them, one more battle might finally secure the realm. Ser Garland Tyrell was no fool. His outriders spotted the Baratheon approach, and the Tyrell horns sounded, echoing off the gentle slopes. By the time Stannis' vanguard came within sight, the Tyrell ranks were drawn up in orderly lines, bright banners snapping. A golden rose on green flew alongside lesser sigils, Oakheart, Fossaway, Hightower, Rowan, and a dozen more sworn houses. The Tyrell knights looked formidable, some in partial plate, others in fine steel with embroidered surcoats. Their numbers were uncertain, but Stannis estimated 5,000 or more. His own host was slightly larger still, yet battered and spread. The outcome would depend on discipline and command. They met on a broad swath of land not far from a winding stream. The Tyrell lines advanced, archers first, with a precision that bespoke good training. Arrows whistled through the air, and the Baratheon shields rose in unison. Then the first ranks closed, steel upon steel. Horses screamed as knights charged. The air filled with dust. Dawn's calm was shattered by the thunder of hooves, the ring of blades, the cries of wounded men toppling to the ground. Davos found himself in the thick of it, holding the center with Stannis. Though Davos was no true-born knight, he had learned enough of war to keep his head in the swirl. The Tyrell cavalry hammered at their line, but Stannis had pikes braced, and the impetus of the first charge was blunted. Then came the second wave of Tyrell foot, pressing forward with shields locked, swords and axes striking. The Baratheons met them stroke for stroke. Screams tore the air. Ser Garland Tyrell soon revealed himself on the Tyrell left, leading a wedge of heavy horse in a calculated attempt to outflank Stannis' right. Ser Roland's storm galloped to intercept, and the two groups of knights collided in a fury. Davos glimpsed bright surcoats swirling in the chaos, the golden rose hammered by the crown stag. Over the din, trumpets from the city's walls announced that watchers in King's Landing were seeing the battle as well. For a time, the field seesawed. The Tyrell archers inflicted a punishing toll with well-placed arrows. Baratheon bowmen answered in kind, focusing their shafts on the Tyrell cavalry. Whenever a gap opened in the lines, a swirl of men poured through, brandishing swords or spears only to be driven back by disciplined ranks. Dust clouds obscured everything, turning the morning sun into a hazy glare. Yet gradually, Stannis' left flank under Ser Justin Massey pressed the Tyrell right backward, forcing them to pivot or risk encirclement. Ser Garland responded swiftly, spurring his knights across the field to bolster his threatened flank. This left Ser Roland's storm a brief moment to drive into the Tyrell center, but Ser Garland's captains realigned, containing the break. The entire battlefield became a swirling mosaic, pockets of intense melee amid shifting lines. Men tripped over corpses, horses screamed, mud spattered from the stream's edge. Over the clangor, Davos occasionally heard Stannis' own war horn, urging them onward. Then, in the chaos, something happened that no one quite expected. A group of Baratheon spearmen, chasing a retreating Tyrell pocket, stumbled upon Ser Garland himself, momentarily isolated from his main host. Garland fought with the prowess for which he was famed, cutting down two spearmen in rapid succession, but an arrow from a Baratheon archer struck his horse in the flank. The animal reared, screaming in agony, and toppled sideways. Garland barely freed himself from the stirrups before the horse crashed to the ground. In that instant, half a dozen Baratheon soldiers surged forward, trying to take him captive or cut him down. A roar rose from the Tyrell lines, for they saw their commander in peril. Knights fought to reach him. Garland, rolling free of the fallen horse, struck at a Baratheon soldier's legs, felling the man. He parried another blow with elegant skill, but a third attacker rammed a spear into his side. Blood darkened his surcoat. Garland reeled, stumbling backward, sword arm trembling. More Baratheon men converged like wolves around a wounded stag. But then, with a shout, a dozen Tyrell knights burst through the press, cutting aside the Baratheon spearmen, forming a ring around Garland. They dragged him to relative safety amid the swirl, striking down any who pressed too close. The rescue was quick and brutal. Davos, fighting a short distance away, felt the surge of adrenaline as men yelled, "Lord Garland is wounded." The Tyrell line quivered at the news. Command was compromised and panic threatened to ripple outward. Sensing his advantage, Stannis bellowed for a coordinated push across the front. Horns echoed. The Baratheons threw their weight into a renewed advance, hacking through the Tyrell lines that faltered without Garland's steady leadership. Men in the golden rose livery began to pull back, uncertain who led them now. Some knights held fast, fighting valiantly to cover the withdrawal of their wounded commander. Others peeled away in confusion. Amid the maelstrom, Davos glimpsed Garland Tyrell, face ashen, being half-carried by his men away from the front. Blood streamed through his armor's joints. The Tyrell knights who remained formed a defensive shell around him, slowly ceding ground. Stannis, sword streaked with gore, urged his men to press, to drive them from the field entirely. Another volley of Baratheon arrows rained on the retreating foe and more Tyrell banners dipped to the mud. The meltdown happened quickly after that. Tyrell discipline, while admirable, could not withstand the shock of their commander's fall. The wedge formation dissolved into pockets of resistance. Some knights chose to flee altogether, galloping in ragged clusters to the northwest, hoping to regroup deeper in Crownland's territory. Others fought doggedly, refusing to yield but forced to inch back under the relentless Baratheon onslaught. By midday, the Tyrell host was in full retreat, streaming away from King's Landing, carrying their wounded commander with them in hopes of saving his life. The Golden Rose had wilted in the face of Stannis' unstoppable push. When the horns sounded a final time to signal the end of battle, the plain was a ruin of trampled grass, muddy pools, and broken men. The day had grown oppressively hot, and the stench of death clung to everything. Stannis stood astride a fallen log, surveying the carnage. Around him, battered knights saluted or bowed, their cheers ragged but real, another victory. The might of the Reach had failed to dislodge them. King's Landing was at Stannis' mercy. But no man present, not even the hardest veteran, felt much elation. They had marched and fought countless times these last weeks, and the cost was there in the groans of the wounded, the sight of bodies half buried in churned soil. Some men simply collapsed where they stood, drooping from exhaustion. Davos sank to one knee, panting, a shallow cut on his thigh sticky with drying blood. Stannis surveyed it all with the same unchanging severity. The sun shone on his sweat-lacquered face. At length, he pointed his sword toward the distant city walls, visible across the field. "Look," he said, voice low but carrying. "They watch us from those walls. They see that the Tyrells have failed." Davos got to his feet, following his king's gaze. Indeed, on the battlements of King's Landing, tiny shapes, the watchers, looked on. Perhaps they waited for sign of a Tyrell triumph that would break the siege. Instead, they saw the Golden Rose banners in flight, leaving the road open for Stannis to do as he pleased. A hush of anticipation gripped the Baratheon host. For them, the day's outcome was clear. The city was truly alone now. Stannis turned to his captains. "Gather the men, treat the wounded, and post fresh pickets. At dawn tomorrow we shall return to our siege lines. No rest for those in King's Landing, nor for us. If they do not yield soon, we storm the gates." That pronouncement caused a ripple of dread and excitement through the ranks. Few men relished the thought of storming the walls. Sieges could be savage. But a sense of finality hung in the air. No rescue remained for Joffrey, not from the west, not from the Tyrells. The city's last vestiges of hope had galloped away with Garland Tyrell's battered host. The watchers on the walls must have known it, too. That night, the battered Baratheon force slept in fits, setting fires to burn away the stench of corpses. Melisandre walked among them, offering blessings to the Lord of Light, promising that the dawn would bring the rightful king's ascension. Davos felt a heavy pit in his stomach. He had been Stannis' man long enough to know that if the city refused to submit, the result could be a bloody assault. And the small folk inside would suffer. Yet he also understood that no realm could ever be at peace if the rightful king was denied his throne. Justice had its costs, as Stannis so often said. True to his word, Stannis began final preparations at first light. Siege engineers dragged makeshift rams and ladders closer to the walls. Where the ground was firm, earthen ramps were shaped to reach vantage points from which archers could strike. Trumpeters sounded warnings to the city. At midday, a second messenger emerged under a white flag, trembling as he declared that King Joffrey offered a ransom of gold if Stannis would depart. Stannis's curt answer was delivered at arrow point. "I do not want his gold. I want his throne." Through all of this, the gates remained barred, the walls manned by a mixture of gold cloaks and Tyrell stragglers. The Red Keep's banners flew above the rooftops. The lion and stag of Joffrey Baratheon, a symbol Davos had come to loathe. For hours, the watchers on both sides stared across the distance, waiting to see if this day would bring an attempted storming. Yet Stannis held back, giving the city one last chance to open the gates in surrender. As evening approached, it became clear that no such surrender was forthcoming. Cersei, it seemed, would gamble on some final stroke of fortune, or perhaps she preferred a last stand. The caged lion is most dangerous at bay. When dawn broke the next day, gray and drizzly, the sky like tarnished silver, Stannis gave the order to advance. Engines rumbled forward, donkey carts carrying ladders, a crude battering ram shaped from a felled oak. The first ranks of spearmen formed up, braced by archers in the rear. A hush weighed upon them. This was not like open battle on the plains. Scaling walls cost men in horrifying numbers. With a blast of trumpets, the Baratheons moved within bowshot. The city's defenders responded with a hail of arrows. Men raised shields overhead, lurching forward, pressing the ram to the gate, or hauling ladders toward the walls. Crenels spat crossbow bolts. A pot of burning pitch cascaded down, setting two men aflame before a handful of archers extinguished them with muddy rags. Screams and curses mixed with the clash of steel. In one corner, a group of Baratheon men hammered at the king's gate with the ram, but the gate's heavy timbers held. Another group attempted to climb the walls near the mud gate, only to be met by spears jabbing downward. The entire city seemed prepared to fight to the last. Yet Stannis pressed them from multiple sides. Melisandre, stationed a safe distance behind the lines, raised her arms in a posture of invocation, though no one could say if that truly aided the assault. Davos led a contingent of seasoned men who had survived the battle with Tywin, directing them to concentrate on a weak point in the walls near an old postern gate seldom used. There, the mortar was rumored to be crumbling. Under heavy covering fire from archers, they hoisted ladders, hooking them onto the parapets. At first, every man who tried to climb was shot down or stabbed. But the Baratheon archers persisted, picking off defenders until a handful of men gained the top. Suddenly, a small breach in the city's perimeter was made. A cheer erupted from below. More men scrambled up. The city guard tried to rally, but confusion took hold. Then, hearing that some portion of the wall had been lost, gold cloaks on the adjacent battlements began to waver. Some turned to flee deeper into the city, perhaps believing the day lost. The chaos spread. Once the postern gate was forced open from within, a rush of Baratheon spearmen flooded through. Shouting echoed in the city streets. The watchers along the main gate realized their flank was compromised. The defenses cracked. Davos, panting from exertion, joined the surge of men pouring in. The slick cobblestones underfoot smelled of garbage and fear. City folk peered out from shuttered windows, wide-eyed at the sight of soldiers bearing the crowned stag. The sound of sporadic fighting came from adjacent alleyways, where pockets of gold cloaks or Tyrell men made last stands. Gradually, those defenders found themselves pinned between the main gate and the new breach, forced to surrender or die. At the King's Gate, the ram hammered one last time, and the battered timbers finally gave way, smashing inward in a splintering roar. Baratheon knights galloped through the wreckage, scattering any defenders who still remained. Within minutes, the gatehouse was under Stannis' control. Horns blared victory notes. The city was his, or nearly. Pockets of resistance flared throughout King's Landing. A detachment of gold cloaks tried to block the main thoroughfare leading up to the Red Keep, but collapsed under a well-timed pincer from Davos's men and Ser Rolandstorm. Panicked small folk flooded side streets, clutching children and whatever valuables they could carry. Some hid in cellars or behind half-broken doors. They had survived the War of the Five Kings thus far, only to see the city sacked again, or so they feared. Stannis, however, had made it known that any soldier found pillaging or raping would face his wrath. "We take the city to save it from false kings, not to punish the innocent," he had declared. A sense of discipline held among most Baratheon ranks, enforced by vigilant officers. That did not prevent all atrocities, war seldom does, but it prevented the city from descending into a full-scale slaughter. Still, chaos reigned. Smoke rose in places where fires had been lit, whether by defenders or frightened mobs. Bells began to toll throughout the city, a mournful dirge that signaled the end of Joffrey's reign, if not the city's. Up the twisting roads, the Red Keep loomed, seat of the monarchy. No word had emerged from within its red stone walls. Many expected the final standoff to take place there. Stannis himself led a column of knights, ascending the main thoroughfare behind heavy shields. Crossbow bolts pinged off stone corners, but fewer defenders showed themselves now. By the time they reached the iron portcullis that guarded the Red Keep's outer yard, a hush stilled the air. A cluster of Kingsguard K. Knights stood beyond the portcullis, weapons drawn, facing inward rather than out. Something was amiss. Among them stood the hound Sandor Clegane, who was rumored to have deserted once before but now reappeared. He glowered at the approach of the Baratheons but made no hostile move. Then, with an abrupt heave, the portcullis began to rise, lifted by unseen hands at the winch. The clang of chains echoed. Stannis and his men looked on in tense confusion. When the gate had risen high enough for a man to pass, the tall figure of the hound stepped forward, sword in hand, but held low. He called out in a rough bark. "Cersei's brats and her pet knights are at each other's throats." The Queen Regent locked herself away in Maegor's holdfast with the Boy King. "City's yours if you can break those doors." Stannis eyed him with suspicion. "Why do you tell me this?" Sandor spat. "I'm done with the city's madness. I'd sooner see a true king than that whelp. Do as you like." A silent exchange passed between them. Then Stannis gestured. His knights approached cautiously, swords half-drawn. The hound stepped aside, letting them pass into the outer ward. Beyond, the Red Keep's inner keep and Maegor's holdfast stood behind another set of stout doors and walls. Shouts and steel rang out there, presumably the last pockets of men loyal to Joffrey or to Cersei, uncertain whether to fight or flee. Stannis advanced, wave after wave of Baratheon men pushing behind him. Soon, they seized control of the Red Keep's yard as some of the Lannister household guards threw down their arms. Searching for a final stance, a handful of Kingsguard knights had retreated into the holdfast. A shrill cry broke the tumult. Joffrey's voice, high and panicked, echoed from beyond the locked doors. "Get away. I am your king. You'll all hang for treason." Stannis ignored the shrieks, focusing instead on the heavy oak doors that sealed Maegor's holdfast. His knights set to work with axes, hacking at the wood. The sound of splitting timber rose above all else. A hush fell among those in the courtyard. Even the hound stood by warily, arms folded. Davos wiped sweat from his brow. It all felt surreal that the war might be moments from ending with a few more swings of an axe. At last, with a splintering crunch, the doors gave way. Baratheon soldiers surged in, weapons raised. Inside, the corridor was choked with a handful of Lannister red cloaks. A savage melee erupted, men thrusting swords in tight quarters, the clang of steel deafening. Leading from the front, Ser Roland Storm hacked through a guard, clearing space for others to push forward. Joffrey's shrieks grew louder. Cersei's voice cut through the din. "You will not have him. You will not take us." But it was too late for defiance. The red cloaks were overwhelmed, forced back into a final chamber. Baratheon knights kicked down the door. Candlelight illuminated a scene of chaos, overturned furniture, tapestries askew. Cersei Lannister stood in the center, hair disheveled, clutching a small crossbow in trembling hands. Joffrey cowered behind her, tears streaking his cheeks, face contorted with rage and fear. At their side, the white-cloaked figure of a Kingsguard, Boros Blunt, wielded a longsword, though he looked half ready to wet himself. Stannis stepped in, every inch the conqueror. His sword, still smeared with the blood of countless battles, hung at his side. Helm removed, his eyes locked on the farce of a king who stood behind his mother. In that tense hush, you could hear Joffrey's ragged breathing, the frantic pulse of fear. Baratheon men fanned out behind Stannis, blades at the ready. Cersei glared, crossbow unsteady in her grip. "You have no right," she hissed. "He is the king." Stannis's voice was cold as winter steel. "He is no king, but a product of incest between you and your brother Jaime Lannister. All the realm knows it now. Your pretense is ended." Lies, Joffrey shrieked, though his voice cracked. Your father was no king. My father was Robert. At that, Stannis's temper snapped. He strode forward, heedless of the crossbow. Your father was my brother. But your mother bedded Jaime Lannister. By all the laws of gods and men, you are no Baratheon. The War of the Five Kings ends here. Cersei's finger twitched on the crossbow trigger. In a flash, a Baratheon knight lunged forward, knocking her aim astray. The bolt fired wild, splintering into the wall. 2 more knights closed in, wresting the bow from her grasp. She screamed, cursing them, spitting like a cornered cat. Joffrey stumbled backward, tears streaming as he fumbled for a dagger. Boros Blunt made a feeble attempt to defend them, but 4 Baratheon blades pressed at his chest. He dropped his sword and sank to his knees, trembling. Joffrey tried to hide behind his mother, but the knights seized him by both arms, dragging him into the open. He kicked and wailed. The Child King, once rumored to revel in cruelty, now quivered in the face of real steel. His mother shrieked, "If you so much as harm a hair on his head, Stannis." Stannis stared at her with nothing but grim finality. "Boy," he said, addressing Joffrey, "you are no true Baratheon. You are the product of treason. I will not slay a child in cold blood, but you will face justice before the realm." Joffrey spat at him. "I'll have your head, you traitor." A blow from the butt of a spear silenced him. The knights hauled him away, ignoring Cersei's fury. She struggled so violently that 2 men had to restrain her, pinning her arms to her sides. Tears streamed down her face, but the hatred in her green eyes was incandescent. In that moment, the proud Queen Regent was powerless, her illusions undone. Stannis turned away, motioning to his men to remove them all. Boros Blunt was led out in manacles, the last of the King's Guard. Cersei continued to hurl invective, hair tangled, face twisted. Joffrey was carried off, his furious shrieks echoing through the holdfast corridors. A hush fell among those who remained. The war was over, at least in this city. The seat of power had fallen. Stannis Baratheon, rightful heir, stood in the heart of the Red Keep. Outside, the city lay battered but unburned. Soldiers in crowned stag livery replaced the gold cloaks in the streets. Bells still tolled, but in confusion rather than orchestrated ceremony. The entire realm would soon learn. King's Landing was in new hands. Davos Seaworth, limping slightly from his thigh wound, entered the room, eyes scanning the havoc. When he found Stannis, he breathed a sigh. "Your Grace." Stannis turned, his gaze distant. Blood stained his surcoat, and the lines of his face seemed deeper than ever. "It is done," he said in a hoarse whisper. "I have taken what is mine." In the corridor, soldiers hustled about, securing the captured royals, stamping out any last pockets of resistance. Melisandre appeared in the doorway, her red robes swirling about her ankles like living flame. The ruby at her throat glowed. "The night is vanquished, my king," she said softly. "Our cause triumphs." Stannis did not answer immediately. He moved to a narrow window, gazing down at the city. From here, the rooftops of King's Landing stretched in uneven lines, the smell of smoke and fear rising. Even with the city taken, 1,000 challenges remained. The realm lay in tatters, the north still at war, the riverlands ravaged, the westerlands uncertain, the reach bruised and humiliated. The Ironborn raided the coasts. Dorne simmered, watching with interest. And what of the threat beyond the wall? Whispers from the north spoke of wildlings and darker foes. Davos joined him at the window. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Stannis turned his head slightly. "Bring me a maester," he said. "We will send ravens. The city is mine, and the boy sits in a dungeon. Let all the realm know. I, Stannis of House Baratheon, am the king on the Iron Throne." Davos bowed. "Yes, your grace. And the Queen Regent? Will she stand trial?" "She will," Stannis replied curtly. "She and the boy and all who kept that falsehood alive. But we will not stoop to cruelty. Justice, not vengeance. I will show the realm the difference between a butcher and a king." Melisandre nodded, that secretive smile on her lips. "The flames have guided us here. In time, the rest of Westeros will kneel, one lord after another." So began the swift unrolling of events in King's Landing under its new master. In a matter of days, the stag banner replaced the lion and stag of Joffrey. Gold cloaks were disarmed and reordered. The The Tyrell men captured within the city were given a choice: pledge loyalty or be confined. Some chose to yield, hoping for eventual ransom. The small council was disbanded. Men like Pycelle cowered, uncertain of their fates. Others, like Varys, melted away, nowhere to be found. Through it all, Stannis remained the same austere figure, dispatching edicts, hearing pleas, ensuring a measure of order returned to streets still jittery from the siege. Joffrey himself was locked in a tower room guarded day and night. Cersei was placed elsewhere under constant watch. She raged and threatened, but Stannis refused to speak with her directly. Instead, a panel of loyal lords was arranged to weigh the charges of incest, regicide, and deception. Some said that Jaime Lannister still roamed free, a prisoner of Robb Stark, or possibly exchanged. If he yet lived, he remained far from King's Landing. Trials were to commence once the city was secured and the realm informed. A fortnight passed. Letters flew by raven to all corners of Westeros. One by one, responses trickled in. Some lords bent the knee swiftly, preferring not to risk a confrontation with the man who had crushed Tywin Lannister. Others stalled. The North, following Robb Stark, made no immediate submission, for they had declared themselves a separate kingdom already. The Vale, under Lysa Arryn's rule, remained aloof. The Greyjoys, off on their own campaigns, scarcely acknowledged the change. Yet the Tullys, hearing of Tywin's downfall, seemed more open to peace. House Martell sent back a politely worded message: they would consider recognition of Stannis's claim if justice for Elia Martell was revisited. Such negotiations would be thorny. But the first step was that the Iron Throne was no longer in Lannister hands. In King's Landing itself, the mood was subdued. Food supplies gradually improved as Baratheon's supply trains arrived. Orderly patrols replaced the chaos of the siege. Public punishments of looters signaled that the new king meant what he said about discipline. The Red Keep, while still retaining its name, shed its Lannister draperies. The great throne room, where the Iron Throne rose in twisted steel, witnessed the crowning of Stannis by Melisandre in a modest ceremony. Few lords were present, and the city's small folk were wary, uncertain how to greet the stern new king. But Stannis ascended those iron steps nonetheless, proclaiming his reign. Melisandre called down blessings from the Lord of Light, though many in the city clung to the Seven. It was a tense melding of faiths at best. 3 days after Stannis's crowning, the day of reckoning arrived for the false king. In the Hall of 1,000 Candles, a broad chamber near the throne room, Joffrey Baratheon was led before a makeshift tribunal. He wore chains at his wrists, face a blotchy mask of tears and resentment. Cersei was brought in next, eyes hollow, hair hanging limp. A hush fell over the onlookers, who included a handful of lords newly sworn to Stannis, as well as city notables. Davos watched from one side, arms folded. Near him stood Melisandre, expression calm. Stannis rose from a carved chair that served in place of a formal throne. At his side was a maester with a record of charges. The accusations included treason, regicide, for Joffrey had commanded the death of Ned Stark, an anointed lord, and false claim to the throne through incest. Joffrey screamed protests, calling Stannis a usurper. Cersei spat vile curses. But each time Stannis's voice cut through. "You have been judged by the law of gods and men," he declared. "You have stolen the throne, sowed war throughout the realm, and executed lords unjustly. For these crimes, the penalty is death. Yet I am no butcher king. If you have anything to say in your defense, speak now." Joffrey continued to cry and curse, nonsensical in his fury, offering no real defense. Cersei refused to speak beyond shrieking that her father, Tywin Lannister, would have vengeance. A hush fell when Stannis lifted his hand. "So be it," he pronounced. "The boy's life is forfeit. The mother's fate is yet to be determined." Thus, on that same evening, Joffrey Baratheon was taken to the yard outside the Red Keep. The sun hung low, turning the sky a lurid orange. Gathered soldiers and a small crowd of onlookers bore witness. Stannis, pale but resolute, declared that a headsman would carry out the sentence. The boy king, hardly more than 14, was dragged to the block, still screaming. At the final moment, he sobbed for his mother, but she was not permitted near. One blow ended the reign of the bastard king. Gasps rippled through the watchers. The hush of finality engulfed them. Blood pooled around the block. Davos, turning away with a tremor of mixed relief and sorrow, realized that some lines had been irrevocably crossed. A child had met a violent end in the name of justice, though that child had been monstrous in many ways. It was the price of war. Stannis, jaw clenched, said nothing, but the set of his shoulders suggested that no matter how stern he was, he felt the weight of what he had done. In the days that followed, House Lannister's hold on power unraveled further. Cersei was confined under house arrest in the Red Keep, awaiting trial. Tommen and Myrcella, discovered to be fathered by Jaime as well, had been smuggled away before the siege concluded, some said, or hidden by loyalists inside the city. A half-dozen contradictory reports circulated. Stannis, with too many pressing issues at hand, let the search proceed at a measured pace. The city demanded order, the realm demanded leadership. One child's disappearance could wait, for the time being. And so King's Landing began the slow, fraught process of adjusting to a new regime. Stannis named a new small council, calling upon lords who declared for him, men like Davos Seaworth, now confirmed as Hand of the King. Melisandre took no official office but remained the closest advisor in matters of faith. A few Stormlands lords who had been uncertain after Renly's death came forward now to pledge fealty. The rumor that Tywin Lannister might yet live at Harrenhal caused worry, but no sign of him reappeared. Meanwhile, ravens flew to Highgarden, inviting the Tyrells to make peace. Stannis had no intention of fighting a full-scale war with the Reach if it could be avoided, though pride and wounds inflicted on both sides made it far from a simple matter. Little by little, the capital breathed again. Bread returned to the markets, albeit at high prices, and lines of refugees trickled back. Though no one cheered in the streets for King Stannis, he lacked the charismatic flourish of his late brother Robert. There was at least a cautious sense that the city might be governed by discipline rather than cruelty. The memories of Joffrey's capricious tyranny remained fresh. Beyond the city walls, the realm's divisions still loomed large. The North had crowned Robb Stark, who battled what remained of Lannister power in the Riverlands. The Greyjoys raided the coast, seizing advantage in the chaos. Dorne watched, harboring old resentments from the days of Robert's rebellion. Yet in King's Landing, the unthinkable had happened. Stannis Baratheon sat the Iron Throne, unchallenged within the capital, with Joffrey dethroned in the most final way. Davos Seaworth often stood on the high balconies of the Red Keep, gazing toward the sunset. He thought of how swiftly fortune changed. Mere weeks ago, they were outcasts on Dragonstone, licking wounds from the defeat at the Blackwater. Now the crown adorned Stannis's brow, for better or worse. Yet the road ahead would be anything but peaceful. Rebellions, rival claimants, the creeping winter from the north. He could almost feel the chill from beyond the wall. That, too, would demand the new king's attention. Duty, as Stannis often said, was a chain that weighed heavier than any anchor. One late evening, Davos found Stannis alone in the royal solar. The new king sat at a massive table, the painted table from Dragonstone brought all the way to the Red Keep, its surface depicting the map of Westeros. Candles burned around him, their light dancing over his tired features. He looked older than Davos remembered, as though the final victory had left a deeper mark than the battles themselves. Davos cleared his throat softly. "Your Grace." Stannis barely lifted his head. "Sit, Davos. We have much to discuss. The North, the Stormlands, Dorne, the letters multiply." Davos sank onto a bench opposite. "Yes, Your Grace. The realm is large and it is wounded. You will need time and wise counsel to bind it together." Stannis' eyes flickered. "Time is a luxury. The snows creep down from the north. The Night's Watch begs for men and support. 1,000 rumors claim the dead walk. I cannot ignore it." He exhaled, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Yet if I march north, the southern lords may revolt. The Tyrells, they will not easily bow after losing 2 battles." Davos nodded. "That is why we must negotiate carefully. Show the realm you are just, not cruel. Restore order and punish only the guilty, those like Cersei and the boy. If men see you offer stable rule, they will come." Stannis made a soft, derisive sound. "I am no jester to flatter them. They will come or they will face my wrath." Yet after a moment he added, "But yes, I will show them justice. Lawler guide me." Davos glanced at the flickering flame of a nearby candle. "Your Grace, you know I have my doubts about." Stannis cut him off gently. "I know, Davos. And that is why I keep you near. You are honest, which is more than I can say for most. Serve me well, and we will see this realm put to rights." Night deepened, and beyond the windows of the Red Keep, King's Landing's lights twinkled in uneasy rest. Stannis rose from the painted table and clasped Davos's shoulder. "We have achieved what some deemed impossible. Tywin Lannister is broken, Joffrey undone. Now the future belongs to the living and their choices. We must tread carefully. The War of the Five Kings has not ended simply because I sit this throne. The great war of our age may yet come from the shadows. Davos bowed, feeling the weight of the words. Outside, in the corridors, guards in Baratheon livery passed, the hush of new rule settling over an old city. Yet in the bones of every man who had survived these tumultuous weeks, a single truth rang clear: a decisive shift had come upon Westeros. One bold stroke, Stannis' preemptive strike against Tywin, had tipped the scales. History, from this day forward, would bear a new mark of kingship, shaped by the unyielding figure with storm in his blood and iron in his soul. Even as the last candles guttered in the royal solar, a fresh wind rattled the windows, carrying the scent of approaching winter. The realm would soon learn that no crown is ever truly secure, that victory and loss are illusions in the face of the greater unknown. But for now, for this brittle moment, Stannis Baratheon was king indeed. And all the Seven Kingdoms watched, uncertain whether the dawn that followed would bring lasting light or further shadows stretching from the far north to the edges of an uneasy land. So ended the war's greatest turning point, Stannis the Just, Stannis the Iron King, upon the Iron Throne. Tywin Lannister's defeat rewrote the lines of fate, and though new trials awaited, the memory of that bold gambit, striking at the lion before the lion could bare its fangs, would live on in the annals of Westeros, echoing long after the crows had picked clean the bones of men who had once warred for a seat of swords.